You're lying in bed on a Sunday night, and your brain is doing that thing again. It's running the numbers on your savings account, your rent, your student loans, the cost of eggs somehow, and whether you'll ever actually be able to afford a house or if you'll just be refreshing Zillow listings for the rest of your life like some kind of emotional self-harm ritual. And then, right in the middle of that spiral, you open your phone and donate $20 to a climate organization, or you share a post about mental health awareness, or you text your friend and say, "Hey, I've been thinking about you. Are you okay?" And here's what gets me about that. Both of those things are happening in the same person. The anxiety and the hope, the dread and the doing something anyway. If you were born somewhere between 1981 and 1996, there's a very good chance you know exactly what I'm talking about, because millennials might be the most psychologically contradictory generation that's ever existed. And I think that contradiction is the most interesting thing about them. Let's start with the anxiety because that part is loud. It's the part everyone talks about. Millennials have been called the anxiety generation, and the data backs it up. Research consistently shows they experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and chronic stress than previous generations. They're twice as likely as baby boomers to report poor mental health. During the pandemic, younger cohorts, millennials and Gen Z, scored significantly worse on every measure of psychological distress compared to older adults. And even now, years later, roughly a third of millennials say they feel stressed or anxious most of the time. Not sometimes, most of the time. But here's the thing people usually skip over. They don't just feel the anxiety, they name it. They talk about it, they go to therapy for it. Millennials represent the largest share of Americans actively seeking therapy, nearly half of all people, currently in treatment. That's not a sign of weakness. That's a cultural shift. Previous generations were told to push through, to tough it out, to keep their struggles private. Millennials looked at that model and said, no, that's not working. Something needs to change. And then they actually changed it. And I think that's where the story of this generation gets misunderstood. People see the anxiety and assume fragility. They see the therapy and assume brokenness. But what if it's the opposite? What if the willingness to say, I'm not okay, is actually the bravest thing a generation has ever done? Let me take you back for a second. Picture it. You're 19, maybe 22. It's 2008. The economy just collapsed. Your parents are losing their house or their retirement, or both. You're either in college watching your future job market evaporate, or you've just graduated into a world that has no room for you. And before that, you watched the towers fall on live television when you were still in school. You grew up with color-coded terror alerts on the news. You came of age during two wars that no one could clearly explain the purpose of. And yet, something strange happened. Instead of becoming cynical, an enormous number of millennials became hopeful. They showed up in record numbers for the 2008 election. Two-thirds of voters under 30 cast their ballot for a candidate who literally ran on the word hope. That wasn't naivety. That was a generation looking at the wreckage and deciding, almost stubbornly, that things could still get better, that they could be the ones to make it better. This is what psychologists sometimes call active coping. It's the difference between being overwhelmed and being overwhelmed but still doing something. And it might be the defining psychological trait of this entire generation. Millennials didn't just inherit problems. They inherited a belief, maybe from their boomer parents, maybe from the culture, maybe from sheer necessity that individuals can make a difference. Research from the Case Foundation found that millennials view all of their assets, their time, their skills, their voice, their spending power, as tools for change. They don't just write checks, they buy differently. They work differently, they talk differently. They treat social engagement not as an occasional duty, but as an ongoing practice woven into everyday life. And yet, the bills still come. The housing market is still absurd. The student loans are still there. The planet is still warming. And this is where it gets psychologically fascinating, because the brain is not designed to hold hope and dread in the same hand forever without something giving way. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance, and it's usually taught as this dry academic thing. But for millennials, it's a lived experience. Every single day, you believe the world can get better. You also see the evidence that it might not. You want to save for the future. You also know you might not have one in the way your parents did. You care deeply about mental health. You also can't always afford the copay. That tension, it's not a flaw, it's the engine. It's what drives millennials to simultaneously doom scroll and then organize a fundraiser, to feel crushed by the news and then volunteer on the weekend. The anxiety isn't separate from the hope. They're two sides of the same coin, and that coin is caring. Caring so much that you can't look away, even when looking hurts. Here's something I think about a lot. There's a theory in neuroscience about why anxious people are often the most empathetic. The same neural circuitry that makes your brain hyper alert to threat also makes it hyper attuned to other people's pain. The amygdala doesn't just process fear, it processes social information, emotional signals, the subtle shift in someone's voice that tells you they're not fine, even when they say they are. So when an entire generation reports elevated anxiety, that's not just a crisis, it's also a signal. It means they're paying attention. It means they feel things that previous generations were trained to ignore. And millennials didn't just feel it, they built an entire culture around that sensitivity. They normalized therapy. They made vulnerability a value instead of a liability. They created the language we now use to talk about boundaries, emotional labor, toxic positivity, burnout. Before millennials mainstreamed those conversations, most people didn't have words for what they were experiencing. They just thought something was wrong with them. Think about how radical that is. A generation looked at the way the world was handling emotions, which was basically don't, and decided to build a different framework. Not because they were weak, but because the old framework was failing everyone. But I also want to be honest about something, because the story isn't all heroic. There's a shadow side to this, and it matters. The hope that defined early millennial adulthood has taken some real hits. Only about 1 in 4 millennials worldwide now believes the social or political situation will improve in the next year. The optimism of the Obama era, that feeling that the arc of history was bending towards something better, has been replaced for many by a quieter, more cautious kind of persistence. Not hopelessness exactly, more like hope with its eyes open, hope that's been through some things. And that might actually be more useful than the original version, because naive hope is fragile. It shatters when reality doesn't cooperate. But the hope that survives disappointment, that gets knocked down and recalibrates and shows up again anyway, that's resilience. That's not the hope of a generation that hasn't been tested. That's the hope of a generation that's been tested repeatedly and keeps choosing to care. There's a term psychologists use called post-traumatic growth. It describes what happens when people go through genuinely difficult experiences and come out the other side not just intact, but expanded. More empathetic, more purposeful, more aware of what actually matters, and I think that's what we're watching happen to an entire generation in real time. Not a breakdown, a transformation. A messy, anxious, sometimes exhausting transformation, but a transformation nonetheless. So if you're a millennial watching this and you feel that pull in two directions constantly, the part of you that's tired and the part of you that still believes things can change, I want you to know something. That tension isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's a sign that you're holding two truths at once, which is one of the hardest and most human things a person can do. The anxiety means you're paying attention. The hope means you haven't given up. And the fact that you carry both every single day without letting either one win completely. That might be the most that important psychological skill of this century. You're not broken. You're not naive. You're the generation that learned how to care in a world that gives you every reason not to. And honestly, that's kind of extraordinary. If any of this landed for you, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a thought in the comments. Tell me what it's been like carrying both of those things at once. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, send it to them. Sometimes the most hopeful thing you can do is remind someone they're not alone in feeling all of this.